Hello, my name is Raisa Azni Suhaini. I am the instructor for this week's topic. The topic is past continuous. Now, before we begin with the topic, I would like you to look at the passage. I was completing my work in the office. The light above me was flickering. Then I felt it. The ground was shaking. An earthquake. Now, when you look at this passage, were you able to identify the verbs that were in past continuous? Now, how many were there? Well, let's look at the answer. The first one is was completing. Next, was flickering. And the third one was shaking. So if your answer was 3, then you are correct. So for the past continuous tense, we will be looking in the forms and also the functions. Let's look at the past continuous forms. When you want to construct a past continuous, you must of course start with the subject. So the subject can be nouns or pronouns. I'm sure you remember what your nouns are and pronouns. Very good. Now, after your subject, it must be followed by an auxiliary verb. Do you know what the auxiliary verb is? For past continuous, the auxiliary verb used is the be verb. So, since it is in past, therefore, you use was or were. So, the be verb in past will be was or were. Then, it is followed by main verb. Now, the main verb here would be base followed by ing. So, in other words, we call it as present participle. Now, this part here is very crucial for you to remember. As you know, past continuous. So, past continuous, they are seen to be as a couple. You have the past form of the be verb, which is was or were, then followed by continuous. So, when you hear the word continuous, you should automatically remember the verb must be with ing. So now, whenever you see a verb in ing, you must remember to have the be verb. So since this is past continuous, therefore your be verb is in past, was or were. Now, let's look at the construction of the sentences. You have your subject, auxiliary verb, and also main verb. When you want to construct a positive sentence, or in other words, we call it as affirmative, we must start with your subject. So, subject I, he, she, it will be followed by the be verb was, whereas you, we, they would be followed by the be verb were. Note that the letter I there is in a different color because, as you know, I is a very special word as it represents yourself. So for other cases, I may sometimes be in some cases, I can be in plural form or in singular form. So in terms of past continuous, we see I as a singular form. That is why it is followed by the singular be verb, which is was. Now again, after your be verb, was or were, your main verb must be in ing. So if I were to read an affirmative sentence for a singular form, I was speaking to you. Whereas in plural form, you were reading this. Now, if you want to construct a negative sentence, you still start with your subject, I, he, she, it, followed by your be verb, was, whereas for plural, you, we, they, followed by were. However, you have the addition of not. So in terms of construction, you still have subject, auxiliary verb, but you have the additional not, then only followed by the main verb. So if I were to give you an example of a sentence, he was not staying in London. And for plural, we were not playing football. Now, when you want to construct a question, note that it is slightly different. Initially, for affirmative and for negative, you start with the subject, followed by auxiliary verb, and then the main verb. But when it comes to question, you start with the auxiliary verb. So in this case, the be verb was or were, then followed by your subject. So if you use was, it will be followed by I, he, she, or it, whereas for plural, were, followed by you, we, or they. Then only you have your main verb with ing, and of course it ends with a question mark. So if I were to read out an example for you, was he watching TV? For plural, were you waiting for Jack? So here, when you want to construct positive, negative, and question, there is a slight difference. So positive, negative, subject, auxiliary, main verb. But when it comes to question, auxiliary verb, subject, then only your main verb. Now, if you want to construct a yes or no question, you start with was or were, followed by the subject, and then your main verb, which is verb with ing. So similar as a question form, you have your auxiliary verb, your subject, followed by main verb. Now, example here, was I working? Were you working? Was he, she, or it working? Were we working? Were they working? So these are yes or no question. You start with the auxiliary verb, was or were, subject, and verb with ing. And how do you answer a yes or no question? Of course, you answer with a short answer. So if your answer is yes, now the question is, was I working? The answer would be yes, you were. Of course, in this case, if you notice, there's a difference in terms of pronoun. As I am asking, was I working? So of course, when you answer, you would say, yes, you were. So you don't actually have to have the verb with ing. You just have yes, followed by subject, and then your be verb. So similarly, if it was, were you working? Of course, I'm asking you. Therefore, when you answer, yes, I was. Was he, she, it working? Yes, he, she, or it was. Were we working? Yes, you were. Were they working? Yes, we were. Were they working? Yes, they were. Now, if your answer is no, for the first question, was I working? So similarly, you would answer, no, you weren't. So basically, in this case, you add the not after your be verb. So was I working? No, you weren't. Were you working? No, I wasn't. So take note, when it comes to I, it is followed by was. But because the answer is no, so no, I wasn't. Next, was he, she, it working? No, he, she, or it wasn't. Were we working? No, you weren't. Were they working? No, we weren't. Were they working? No, they weren't. So do take note, when you answer a short answer for negative, you often contract. So contractions here means rather than saying, no, you were not, instead, as the question tells you, it is actually a yes or no question, basically a very short question. So you answer with a short answer. So here, when we speak, we often go for short. And short here often meaning contraction. So speaking-wise, do bear in mind, you are able to use the contraction form. But when it comes to writing, you should always use full form. So writing-wise, we don't often answer a yes or no question in writing. But when it comes to speaking, I'm able to ask you questions and you are able to give me short answers. Please remember, when you answer a yes or no question, especially for negative, you contract the negative form. In this example would be, no, you weren't. No, I wasn't. Now, when you want to construct a WH question, you will start with WH word, followed by the auxiliary verb, was or were, then your subject, followed by your main verb. So for example here, how strong was the ground shaking? What was I saying? Who was she calling? So this, of course, will be in the singular form. Whereas plural form, where were you going yesterday? Why were they studying at midnight? Why were they sleeping at work? Now, if you take note of the structure here, you have WH question, was or were, subject and main verb. So quite similar to your question form, you have was or were, your auxiliary verb, your subject, and followed by your main verb, which is in verb, followed by ing. So all you have to do is add WH question first, then auxiliary verb, then subject, then only your main verb, which is verb with ing. Now, if you look at the sentence structured here, how was the ground shaking? And where were you going yesterday? So please take note that these questions for how, what, or who does not necessarily mean it's only for singular. You can also use it in plural form. Similarly, when you use where or why, you can use it with was. So if you look at the WH word who was she calling? So in formal written English, the WH word here should be whom. But for speaking, so remember, as I said just now, when it comes to speaking, the rule is slightly different as when you do writing. When it comes to writing, it always has to be in full form. And of course, in this case, when it comes to who, because we are referring to an object, the object noun, therefore we use whom rather than who. But in speaking, if you notice, most people would say, who was she calling? But again, please remember, when writing in formal writing, it has to be whom was she calling? Now let's look into the past continuous in terms of function. The first function of the past continuous is the past continuous tense expresses action at a particular moment in the past. Let's look at the example here. The situation given: yesterday I watched a film on TV. The film started at 7 p.m. and finished at 9 p.m. Now, if I were referring to a particular time in the past, which is at 8 p.m. So at 8 p.m., I was in the middle of watching TV. So because I'm referring to a particular time within that duration, you have 7 p.m. until 9 p.m. and I'm referring to a particular time in between the duration, which is at 8 p.m. So during that time, of course, I am in the middle of watching TV. So if I were to construct the sentence, it will be, at 8 p.m. yesterday, I was watching TV. Another function of the past continuous is we often use the past continuous tense to set the scene in stories. So we use it to describe the background situation at the moment when the action begins. So here, it actually helps your reader, especially when it comes to writing, to understand the situation, or in this case, the background. So if you want your readers to really grasp the idea of your writing, you must make them understand the background. And how do you do this? Of course, you use the past continuous. So often, the story starts with the past continuous tense and then moves into the simple past tense. Now let's look at the example to understand that explanation. James Bond was driving through town. It was raining. The wind was blowing hard. Nobody was walking in the streets. So now you are able to imagine that James Bond was driving. So in your image, you see a man driving through town. So driving, and at that moment, it was raining. All right, so you have that image in your head, a man driving into town, through the town, and it was raining, and wind was blowing, right? And nobody was walking in the streets. So when you have that image, then suddenly Bond saw the killer in a telephone box. So here you are able to imagine the situation or the background of the story, and suddenly comes the killer. So this actually makes your story a bit more interesting. You are able to basically make your reader imagine what you have in your mind in a writing form. Now, when it comes to past continuous, it is always used with simple past tense. We often use the past continuous and simple past tense together in a sentence. The past continuous describes the longer action that was in progress in the past, and the simple past describes the shorter action that happened in the middle of the long action. So you have an action going on, and then you have something that stops it in the middle, or a short action that stops in the middle in that long action. Now let's look at the example. I was working when I felt the earthquake. So here, as you can see, I was working, which is the long duration, working, then suddenly I felt the earthquake. So the earthquake happened in a short moment there. We also use the simple past, not the past continuous, to show one action followed another. For example here, I alerted my colleagues when I felt the earthquake. So here there's a slight difference. When you are referring to an action that is ongoing and then suddenly something happens, of course you have that long action which is in past continuous, and then you have that short action in simple past. But in this case, I alerted my colleagues. So this is not you doing the action of alerting everyone, hello, hello, hi, there's an earthquake, only then you felt the earthquake. So of course you alerted, it's a short action, and then only you felt the earthquake. So here, the key word here is and then. So first I alerted, and then I felt the earthquake. Whereas the first example given, I was working. So in the middle of working, you felt the earthquake. It's not that you work first, only then you felt the earthquake. Next, when one action interrupts another, we use when before the simple past action or while before the past continuous action. So this is a simpler form, when plus short action to indicate simple past tense. While will be followed by long action, which will mean it is in past continuous tense. So there are 4 basic combinations here. First, I was walking past the car when it exploded. So here the long duration or the long action here is I was walking past the car. So walking, and then something interrupts, which is the explosion. So since I'm using the word when, of course it is followed by the past simple. Then I can start it at the beginning. When the car exploded, I was walking past it. So here, when you look at the sentence structure, after when, it is followed by a simple past. Next, the car exploded while I was walking past it. And I can also say, while I was walking past the car, it exploded. So here, as you can see in terms of structure, after while, it is followed by the past continuous form. When we begin a sentence with when or while, plus a subject and a verb, we put a comma between the 2 parts. So looking at the example again, when the car exploded, comma, I was walking past it. Whereas if I don't start with when, my sentence will be, I was walking past the car when it exploded. So if you notice the tone, when I speak having the when in the middle of the sentence, I was walking past the car when it exploded, rather than when I say, when the car exploded, I was walking past it. So there's a bit of a pause there if you notice. So similarly, while I was walking past the car, it exploded. So the reason why there's a comma there is because of that short pause. So please remember, when you start with when or while, there should be a comma, then only you follow it by your action. We use the past continuous with 2 actions that continued at the same time in the past. So we use while to show action that were happening at the same time. So the example here, while I was hiding under the table, my colleague was looking for me. So here we use both in past continuous form with while because both are actions that are happening at the same time. So while I was hiding, so I'm hiding, at that particular time that I'm hiding, my colleague was looking for me. Now remember, we do not usually use present continuous with non-continuous verbs. The same is true for past continuous tense. So this will be a faulty sentence. I was feeling the earthquake. So the verb feel is actually a non-continuous verb. The correct way of saying it will be, I felt the earthquake. So you should remember what are your non-continuous verbs. An example, a good easy example would be the word like. So if you know, when it comes to like, I like ice cream. Even though at the moment, right now, I do like ice cream, I'm eating ice cream, I do not say I am liking ice cream, right? So similarly, when it comes to past continuous, you do not use certain verbs known as non-continuous verb in the past continuous form. It should always be in simple form. Thank you.